We will now move on to session 2 of the HLCD, which is aligning corporate sector with sustainable development goals. And I'm going to invite our moderator, Mr. Eric Roston, on stage. Eric Roston is Bloomberg.com's editor for energy, natural resources, and sustainability news, and author of the critically acclaimed book, The Carbon Age.
Thank you. It's always nice to come to this event every year. I think I've been to almost every one. I'd like to welcome onto the stage our panelists, Jacob Scher, who is a senior advisor for international affairs at NRDC, Anil Kakani, executive director for global strategy and cross-border initiatives at the Nandrathi Financial Services, and Reed Deakin, Vice President for Energy and Climate at the UN Foundation, and T. Sivakumar from the Indian Exim Bank, who will be able to discuss green bonds. So while we're waiting for everyone to get seated, I'll just introduce the theme of the panel, which is very broad, which is how business can help with the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. So the Sustainable Development Goals, which I sort of explained to people who have never heard of them, is how we're going to fix everything. And so the panel is about how business is going to help fix everything. To sort of put a point on that, in your opening remarks, addressing this topic, I want to really hone it down and give you something concrete to think about this week. And Jake brought it up a second ago, and that is Prime Minister Modi going to the West Coast, to Silicon Valley, to talk to Google and Facebook and Tesla, whoever else, the VCs. That seems to me to fit very directly, to be a very concrete manifestation of what we're supposed to be talking about, which is how are the companies going to help sustainable development? So is that a proper reading of his decision to visit there, or is it a counterexample? I don't know, but I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Reed, do you want to start us out?
Well, that puts me on the spot, Eric. Thank
well,
you.
I wanted to put that out there just so you can sort of marinate on it. Why don't we just, having said that, come back to it later in the panel?
No, actually, I thought it was a provocative question, and I think it's a good one for us to discuss, but I'm gonna pair it with its opposite, which is how does sustainable development help companies? And I think that the one answer leads to the other, that this is in the interest of companies who want to develop markets, to encourage sustainable economic development as well as social development. And there are benefits to be had, and that's why they should be engaged. I will, since you indicated this is our opening shot, I will just take a brief moment to say a little bit more about the Sustainable Development Goals, which, as I think everybody here knows, will be formally adopted by the General Assembly on Friday. This is a new step for the world. People see it as the next step beyond the Millennium Development Goals, but it's different in one important particular, which is the Millennium Development Goals were very clearly aimed at the poorest countries. How do you get basic health care, et cetera. But the Sustainable Development Goals are meant to be universal. They are meant to apply to the United States, to India, as well as to some of the poorest countries in the world. And that raises a lot of different implications for the individual goals, how companies react, and how governments react. I will just focus on one, since we are at the U.S.-India Energy Partnership, and that is Goal 7, because we are particularly proud at the United Nations Foundation for our role in encouraging this. We have been engaged with the UN for the past half dozen years on trying to raise up energy within the UN system generally and the development agenda in particular. Once you think about it, it's hard to believe, but energy was never mentioned in the Millennium Development Goals. And yet I think it seems pretty obvious once you think about it, that if we're going to achieve both economic development, but also improved health, improved education, improved opportunities of all kinds, that energy is an absolutely essential first step. If you're a woman in a rural area and your life is consumed by going and retrieving wood so that you can spend the rest of the day breathing toxic smoke to prepare your family's meals, there's not a lot of economic opportunity available to you. And so getting modern energy services to everybody in the world is really the first step, the precondition for success on all the other development goals. And in fact, I think that will produce benefits. There are 17 goals that will be adopted on Friday. I think you can see the role that energy will play in almost every one of those. So as part of what we have been working on for these past years is to support the Secretary General's initiative on sustainable energy for all, which has 3 goals for 2030. Number 1, universal access to modern energy services, both electricity and clean fuels for clean cooking. Secondly, to double the rate of improvement in energy efficiency, and thirdly, to double the share of renewable energy in the global energy mix. Now, when these 3 goals were put out by the Secretary General in 2011, there were some people who didn't see the connection. And they said, well, I see the access goal for development, and I see the renewable and efficiency goal for climate, but how do those hang together? And yet we've seen again and again that having renewable energy, clean energy, and having that empowered by low-power devices that run very efficiently and consume less power, this is absolutely essential to bringing power to areas that don't have it. So they actually fit together quite well. But the point I'm really circling around again to is that particularly the renewable energy and energy efficiency goals are just as important in Denmark or in Colombia as in China. So these are things that everybody can engage in, and to the point that Eric originally raised, sort of why should corporations care, these are enormous markets around the world, and also will be doing a lot of good in the process.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hi. Jacob, you want to go next?
Good afternoon. I'm Jacob Scher, with a senior advisor to the International Program of the Natural Resources Defense Council. Really pleased to be here. I was at the first U.S.-India Energy Partnership Summit in 2009 and have participated in almost every one since then. And it's been really gratifying to see how that first summit meeting really helped accelerate and galvanize an improving U.S.-India relationship in addressing a whole range of climate and energy issues, and that this summit each year has really contributed to kind of the deepening and enlarging of that dialogue. So it's great to be here. And what I'd like to talk, maybe build a little bit on what Reed was saying, and talk a little bit about another dimension of all of this, which is the fact that these Sustainable Development Goals, in a sense, are going to be truly revolutionary. They are stimulating a discussion about a new type of global architecture to hopefully to speed this transformation to a low-carbon, sustainable world, and one in which corporations will be playing an extraordinarily central role. The last panel people were bringing up Rio, the Earth Summit in 1992, and I was there, and it was kind of interesting. The world adopted an agenda for sustainable development. It was universal. It had about 400 pages, I think about 2,500 separate recommendations, and all of our presidents and prime ministers 25 years ago said, we'll take care of all these problems. In some ways, if you look at the new Sustainable Development Goals, they're like the Cliff Notes. They're 17 goals, and they're about 169 targets. And I agree with Reed. Symbolically, it's extraordinarily important. Once again, they are universal. But it's a big, long agenda, but if you actually read the preface, what you're seeing is that the presidents and prime ministers of the world next week are basically going to come together in New York City and demand a revolution. They don't use the word revolution. That's the word that Ban Ki-moon has used in 2011 in Davos. He called for a free market revolution for global sustainability. Prince Charles has called for a revolution. Pope Francis, who will be here later this week, has called for a revolution. And in a sense, that will be ratified and echoed in the Sustainable Development Goals to be adopted at the end of this week. It is, if you read it carefully, you'll see that there is language in there that says if we don't get a handle on climate change, if we don't get a handle on the poverty issue, then human civilization is at risk. It makes it quite clear that we are, at this point, in the next 15 years, really, what's at risk is sort of the biological support system for human civilization. So there's a real urgency here, and I think that's a new urgency, and it's an urgency that I didn't feel in 1992 about dealing with these problems, but what is quite clear now is that's where we are. I would recommend you take a look at goal number 17, which talks about strengthening the means of implementation and revitalizing the global partnership for sustainable development. And what's happening at the United Nations is really exciting because we're seeing the emergence of a new architecture that recognizes the continued importance of nation states, but for the first time recognizes you can't divide the world neatly into developed and developing, and recognizes the variety of capacities. It also recognizes the central role of so-called non-state players, non-state actors, and subnationals. I like to call them the new actors. I'd like to remind people, for example, that the state of California is the 7th largest economy in the world. So when people say the United States is not doing anything about climate change or energy, I think you have to look at what's going not only at the federal level, but what's looking at the states. And this is true not only in the United States, but also in India and China and other large nations. Secondly, we've seen the emergence of corporations, and I find sometimes that many of the large corporations that are operating in many countries around the world and have been in existence for 100 years or so actually have more of a global perspective than a lot of the nation states. And their footprints are just huge. And they're much bigger than most of the individual countries that are parties to the discussions. So what individual corporations do is extraordinarily important. And what I think is exciting is that this is recognized within these goals. The UN terminology is partnerships. Reed talked about one of the most interesting, successful, sustainable energy for all, which in a sense is, partnership in my view is not exactly the right word. It's more of a network or initiative or alliance, where you have people working together across various sectors on very, very specific problems and really, really producing results on the ground. So let me just say we're at a really, really exciting moment, and I think what we're looking for are for companies to be fully engaged in what's going on in the UN and the development of this new architecture, but really looking at ways in which companies can really take it up and really be involved in the kind of bold and transformative actions that are going to be essential if we're going to preserve and protect this planet. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Anil. And if Mr. Asima Kumar would like to come up, we're still eager to have him.
Thanks, Eric. Again, my name is Anil Kakani. I'm going to put much more of an Indian lens on the topic that we're going to talk about in this panel. But before I do that, I just want to thank TERI and mention my relationship with TERI goes back many years to when TERI was working on a modified mustard seed to deal with vitamin A deficiency issues. And I was working in Hillary Clinton's office in the Senate. And since then, I've gone on to be a board member, a North American board member of TERI, and it's a great honor to be here with all my friends at TERI. Since I left the Senate, have moved kind of around public sector and private sector, and most recently was in India for about 3 years, just moved back earlier this year, with an investment bank, a mid-market investment bank in India, to really focus on cross-border technology transfer, cross-border M&A activity. And if I were to put an Indian lens on the question that, how is India going to meet the Sustainable Development Goals? And also kind of put it in the context of Eric's initial question on why is the Prime Minister going to Northern California? And then to take it back to the last panel where Kaylee asked, what's changed? Well, in the last 2 decades, I'd say what's changed in India is a complete unleashing of consumer demand. So you've got massive amounts of unmet demand for consumer goods, for power, for education, for healthcare. And so Indian companies, large Indian companies, are in the business of delivering that. And they're not necessarily doing it with an eye towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And the only way India is going to hit those goals is in the absence of investment of technology by Indian companies, or even the availability of long-term institutional capital in India, the Prime Minister is going to Northern California in order to tap technology, in order to tap institutional capital. I'll give a couple of examples of transactions that we've worked on in the last couple of years. One, actually, so India has 400 million square feet of commercial office space. We heard a lot about it in the session this morning on energy efficiency in the built space, about 100 million square feet under construction. I've worked with a company, Ecorhythm Technologies, that was in the discussion this morning, and it was one of the things that we did with Ecorhythm is to get an investment from Reliance-backed Gen Next Ventures to bring that technology into India. So Ecorhythm's technology, so instead of investment by Indian companies into hard infrastructure to improve the energy efficiency of companies, we're bringing data-driven technologies into India to improve operating efficiency and energy efficiency of commercial office space. So that's, again, American technology coming into India to help achieve some of the targets that are going to be set forth in the development goals. Likewise, a couple years ago, right here at the TERI Summit, another company we'd work with, Applied Solar Technologies, a pioneer in solar hybrid solutions that are replacing diesel generator-driven or powered telecom towers, ATM machines, petrol pumps, especially, I mean, the RBI, the Central Bank of India, is pushing for every Indian to have access to an ATM machine, or within 15 minutes of an ATM machine. Well, you can have ATM machines, but you don't have power for those ATM machines, so people can get to the ATM machine, but it's not working. Or if it is, the ones that get more foot traffic, they'll put a diesel generator. So Applied Solar, they've raised about $250 million of foreign capital and low-cost debt to expand deployment of their technology in India. They have about 4,000 deployments. It's all solar hybrid solutions. It's energy as a service. How do you manage uptime to make sure that the consumers, whether they be the telco operators or eventually the telco customer or the ATM, the bank customer, gets access to the service that they're seeking? So I think in order for India to achieve these goals, I don't think in the near term are we going to see a massive investment in the development of new technology. It's going to be American technology that's got to flourish in India. Companies like UTC are obviously, they're at it. They've been doing a great job, but we've got hundreds of small. America's the most innovative country in the world. We've got so many great technology-driven companies that we've got to help get access to the Indian markets. And I'm sure, this forum, the TERI Forum, will increasingly become, I think, a venue, the summit, where we talk about how do we bring more and more of this new technology to India, and that's the reason, I think, why the Prime Minister is heading to Northern California.
Thank you very much, particularly for that last, buttoning the last loop there. We'd like to open it up to questions in the audience. Any hands? Or I have a couple. I think one, from the standpoint of just the sort of your average sort of American professional, smart, successful person, I don't know if anyone was surprised that we didn't hear about the SDGs and the Republican debates, but I think one thing that makes it complicated and help me understand how to get around this is, like, we know how laws are supposed to get made in the US. We know there are flow charts for how laws get made, for how businesses make decisions. Like, there's no flow chart that I'm aware of for an enterprise of this scale, of trying to facilitate communication among every sector of everything, to sort of put the world on a footing we'd prefer. So, do you find, or am I wrong? Like, is there a process I don't see? What are the most organic, self-organizing, things you're seeing, so we can get a flow chart so people can understand better what's going on?
Okay, let me try. I think that, as I was indicating, I think one of the challenges we have sometimes in the international arena is every time we come up with a new set of goals or a treaty, it's as though the world is operating with a totally blank slate. The reality is we've had a conversation about sustainability that's going on since 1987 or 88. the world gathered together in Rio in 1992 and agreed to sustainable development. And about 110 nations went home and created their own sustainability councils and stimulated a conversation within their own societies. And if you look back, it was Rio that really stimulated a lot of companies to start looking at this concept of a triple bottom line. And I think if we talk to a lot of people that are associated with companies here, they'll say sustainability is not something new for us. We've been thinking this through. We have policies in place. We have sustainability officers. And so my hope is that, that this new focus or refocus on the sustainable, as a result of the Sustainable Development Goals, will get people to think about, what they're doing. And then as I indicated, we have to have a sense of urgency about this problem. I think, it's really about not just meeting goals. It's literally about transforming the way we power our societies, transport our societies, feed our societies, and house our societies. And we have to make a huge amount of progress in the next 15 years.
I think you're right, Eric, that there's not a forcing function here, that this is hortatory. And I think that, in fact, 17 goals is a lot for anybody to focus on. And in all likelihood, different countries will focus on different pieces of it.
It's probably worth pointing out that the Judeo-Christian God only gave 10.
Well, he obviously left 7 out, but
yeah.
At the same time, I think that Jacob is correct in calling us back to what was Agenda 21, not necessarily universally accepted, but it's sort of setting a world's agenda. And this is, I think, a moment when all the countries of the world are coming together and say, yes, we have these common aspirations. Now, does that mean that we're going to all proceed in the same way toward those ends? I don't think so. But I think that having those common aspirations are helpful in an increasingly globalized world. And if I'm thinking about this from a corporate perspective, I'm going to have the same SDGs in India as I am in the US. And so there is some value in that as well.
Don't see any hands, which means, oh, here we go.
You are talking about technology developed in the United States and being deployed in India. Manufactured in India? How does made in India affect all this? And does it inhibit it in any way?
It doesn't inhibit. I mean, eventually, for manufactured products, I think most companies prefer to especially, component makers, where the system's going to be integrated at some, near. The manufacturing of the components oftentimes will be closer to where the integration happens. I worked for Corning Incorporated for a number of years, so we always, manufactured close to our customers who were big system integrators. With some of the kinds of technologies we're talking about, these are really data-driven, and again, so Applied Solar, for instance, buys solar panels from all over the place. It's really the remote monitoring, the algorithmic technology to maintain uptime. But they're buying batteries. For battery, so power storage is a great example of, India's only ever really going to become, the need for power storage technology is critical in India, right? We're still using lead acid batteries, very old school at all these diesel genset sites. But to bring in lithium-ion cells is very expensive. There's high customs on them. So for certain, that's a specific example. But I think over time, we are going to see more and more products manufactured in India. Even companies that have developed technologies here in the U.S., whether they be Apple, whether they be Corning, manufacturing is global. And so I would expect that more and more, as a market for these technologies grows in India, we're going to see more manufacturing happen there naturally.
Anyone want to jump in? No? Okay. Any other questions? I had another one, and while I'm sort of scanning the audience, I asked the question earlier about the SDGs because it does seem like there's a healthy vector between the SDGs and corporate sustainability. As of a year or two ago, there was one company in the S&P 500 that didn't produce a sustainability report. What advice could everyone take to to business leaders they encounter and say, look, here's how you marry these two trends together, the SDGs and corporate sustainability, ESG?
Well, I'd be repeating myself a little bit, but I think that you just have to say it's good for business. I think that whether you're thinking about creating markets for your product or more near-term your public image in these markets, I think that there are obvious benefits to corporations engaging in these trends. I want to go back a little bit to something that Ray Vickery said in the earlier session about the importance of public-private partnerships, and in this context, it makes a lot of sense. The one thing you could say with a certainty about the SDGs generally and the energy goal in particular is it's not going to happen through ODA, through foreign aid. It's going to happen through private investment. And so really what this is a matter of getting the public and private agendas aligned. And I think they are for the mutual benefit of each. Certainly you can see if a community or a region has little or no power, they're not going to be much in the way of consumers and nor producers for that matter. So seeing how we turn sort of India into the next China, Africa into the next India, how you keep moving that line along, I think is really going to be critical for market growth for corporations as well.
Let me just make two suggestions about how companies might take a look at the new SDGs and get involved with them. One would be to kind of look at your current sustainability principles and guidance and try and bring them as much as possible into line with the way the world now wants to be organizing this discussion in the years coming. And so that's one element of it. And then the second would be to look at the goals, the individual goals and the targets, and see if they're ones in which your particular company really wants to make an additional investment and engagement. If you look at the MDGs, which the Millennium Development Goals that were adopted in 2000 and which were seen as being very, very successful in many regards, where we saw success in some cases, for example, when we saw just a few 100 million people coming out of poverty over the last 10 to 15 years, particularly in places like China and India. It's not clear that the leaders were motivated by the SDGs, but in a number of areas, what we saw was the evolution or the development of sort of a network or a partnership of companies, international agencies, countries, civil society organizations that said, we're going to work together to really make things move in regard to a particular one of the goals. And I think that's what we really want to be looking at. And I think this is where we're really looking for companies to really sort of step it up and to really become leaders in this new kind of architecture that we're seeing emerging. Non-globally negotiated arrangements, I sometimes call them commitment platforms, or sometimes called networks, alliances, partnerships, initiatives. And I think this, moving forward, this is the way the world's really going to make this transformation. And I think companies, and I think we've seen this with the example of Sustainable Energy for All, have an absolute central role in not only joining these particular enterprises, but really strengthening the capacity of the world to work towards solutions in this way.
Can I just add something there? So I think that's a really important point on the need for both business, but in particular the press, to shine a light on these goals. If you look at the Millennium Development Goals and how India really underperformed, came on some of them behind Bangladesh, behind Pakistan, behind Nigeria in some cases, but the press never reported on it. So there's no shame associated with the fact that, and there might have been very good reasons, but those of us who cared about these things, were kind of in disbelief that no one else cared. So I think it's really critical for these goals to have effect, to really make a difference. I mean, as a community, as the role of the press, the role of I mean, I don't know if business is the one that's going to really shine light on it if they're not, but I think your point's well taken. There has to be more public exposure and a spotlight shown on this.
Thank you. I'm not shocked that there's no questions in a room full of people this size. I would be shocked if there were no opinions. So forget about questions. Like, what does anybody think about all this? Are we not being offensive enough? Is that why there's no provocation here? I mean, I could, just for the sake of argument, sort of push back at something Reed said earlier, which is talking about the universal intention of the SDGs. I noticed, shortly as I was coming here, I noticed on one of the social media platforms that the editor of MIT's Technology Review said he was editing a 6,000-word story about how India has so much coal. Basically, the question of what India does with its coal is the only question that really matters when it comes to climate change and global sustainability. So those are two bookends. Like one, these are universal goals for everyone. On the other hand, the only thing that matters is that India figures out how to live without coal. So any thoughts on how to reconcile those two things? Anyone?
Well, I think that each country is going to have to respond in their own way, obviously. I think that coal is increasingly not the issue in the United States, and it is in India. So things will be adapted to local circumstances. The classic case we have in the renewable energy space is how can Brazil double its renewable energy penetration when it's already at 80%? So these things have to be adaptable to local circumstances. But I do think that, to take Jacob's point earlier, that shining a light on these, on this agenda, on these questions, has the effect of mobilizing the international system around them. And even though, to take the example he mentioned, I think that most of the economic development gains from people rising out of poverty occurred in China. Now you could say, would that have happened without the MDGs? Possibly, but I think that the MDG mobilization helped in various aspects of that.
Your ball. No?
Well, now I just want to make the point that I think that just sort of respond a little bit to Reed. I think that, one of the big challenges and something that I've worked on and off for 25 years is how do you take a set of global goals up here and then actually turn them into reality on the ground. And one of the big challenges we've had, not only with the SDGs, but also in the climate change arena, is that quite often the discussions take place at a very, very high abstract level, which sometimes doesn't provide very useful metrics to measure whether or not you're really making progress where it matters, which is the national level and below. I would argue that the Sustainable Development Goals have been helpful already in bringing the NGOs around the world working on poverty issues together with NGOs around the world working on climate change. There's an organization called Action 2015, which has about 1,500 non-governmental organizations around the world that has become very, very active around both the SDGs, and then we'll move forward to Paris, which at the end of the year, which will be extraordinarily important, not only in terms of creating a revised framework for governments to cooperate with one another over the next 15 years, but more importantly, a place that is going to really hopefully stimulate action by the whole variety of stakeholders to actually do something about climate change now. I think the SDGs are, like I say, it will structure the international conversation, but I think unless we figure out a way to really get much more attention to this issue at the national level and hopefully to reinvigorate efforts that were made in many, many countries in the 90s to kind of look at sustainability in their society and make new plans, it will not produce the kind of results we like moving forward, but I think there's potential.
We have about 2 more minutes.
Hi, Bob Eichort from State Department, having been involved in this process over the last year and thinking about our position and chairing the working group on energy. I think one of the things that's been alluded to here is, and Jacob, you just mentioned it, is the issue of metrics and the monitoring of these targets. And I think we're lucky on the energy side because we already had formulated three targets, and that they held up under the scrutiny of the G77, which was no small feat, I think. I think that so for all of the goals, I think that this question of what is the concrete mechanism with regards to how we're going to track this is going to be very important. We're also lucky that, in a sense, the World Bank, IEA, and others have banded together to develop the global tracking framework. And the recent report came out last summer that, in a sense, gives us a good baseline to start with on the 3 goals. But clearly, there are huge data requirements that are going to be needed if we're going to really do this on a regular basis. I think that clearly the document encourages countries to pursue an integrated planning process, and how that's going to happen is going to be very difficult. I mean, as many of you know, over the last several years, we've been pursuing the low emissions development strategies and trying to work with governments to get different ministries to interact so that there is some breaking down of the silos. And I guess, I mean, as Reed knows, we've had a lot of discussion in the SE for All process about how do you begin to link energy and water and health and food and all those kinds of issues. And I think that's going to be very important as over the next couple of years, is how do we get a more integrated approach to these sustainable development problems. And I think, you know, I mean, the document also encourages regional approaches too. So the role of regional organizations, whether it's banks, the regional commissions, and other organizations, is going to be important in terms of getting the countries in a particular region to try to work together on this, so it's not just a one-off process, that there's really a sort of a team approach that's developed in certain areas. So we'll see how there's a lot of jockeying now as to who's going to be on the lead on certain goals and things like that. But as you know, in the SE for All context, we've just announced a new organization that will be a focal point based in Vienna. And Rachel Kite, has been Vice President of Climate at the World Bank, is going to be the new head of it. So we're pleased that looks like it's going to be a solid institution to try to further this process. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Any closing thoughts, Reed?
Well, I can't leave an SDG discussion without the pithy summary. 17 goals is a lot, but the phrase that's going around is, we can be the first generation in history to eliminate extreme poverty, and we're the last generation that can address climate change.
Yeah, I would just sort of go back and pick up on the point that Bob made about the kind of the importance of efforts like sustainable energy for all, multi-stakeholder, sort of associated with the UN, but now is going to be moving slightly outside of the orbit, and to really try and think about, you know, what is the architecture that we want to have around this set of goals that is truly going to drive bold and transformative action. And I think the challenge for the United Nations is it has one foot firmly in the 21st century. It's aware of all the new tools and the ability to reach people in a way that wasn't possible, and to collect data and to create greater accountability. But on the other hand, it has another foot firmly in the last century and some of the patterns that are called for. The last thing we need is for countries to go back again and rewrite their sustainability plans. And I think really, at this point, we really have to get people to realize that there is a real sense of urgency that many of us who are old enough in this room didn't have 20 or 30 years ago, but should have now. And secondly, that the technologies and the methods are at hand, and it's really about creating the political will. And that'll happen in part by putting a spotlight on presidents and prime ministers, but it'll also occur if we can inspire a new generation to really demand that their leaders act in the next 5 to 10 critical years to bring about this necessary transformation.
I'll just complement that by saying, the role again of technology and of capital, which, will be purely, I think the goals put the spotlight on the issue, but the execution of them will really be driven by capital and technology, and look forward to working with you all on that.
Thank you very much. We have a big fall ahead of us. We're all going to learn a lot. I will ask us to, I guess, leave for the next panel, which I'm on.